All right, Rabbi Kevin, teach us.
Okay, so this for always for the Cholim of Israel.
Amen.
And we're continuing with the theme of treating a sick person. What they're going to discuss here is limitations. Whenever possible, one should try to keep malachic activity to a minimum if the patient will not suffer any harm or delay as a result. For example, if one is dressing a wound with a bandage which is too long, one should not cut it but continue to wrap it around the wound. According to certain authorities, any necessary malacha should be done by a Gentile. However, this is only if it would be carried out with the same speed and efficiency if it had been done by oneself. If practical, malacha should be performed in an unusual manner, or shinoi, provided that no delay will be caused by this. For example, if a light must be turned on, it should be done with the elbow rather than the hand. Need for malacha applies only during the emergency itself. It ceases immediately afterwards. For example, if one drives a patient to the hospital by car, one may not drive back afterwards unless it may be necessary to attend to other emergency cases. If one has to telephone a doctor or hospital, the telephone receiver should be replaced in an unusual manner at the end of the call. Otherwise, others may have difficulty making contact. And then I'll just go over that one, which is childbirth. A woman who is giving birth is considered an emergency case for whom malacha must be performed. Wherever possible, one should attempt to perform the malacha in an unusual manner. As in the case with other emergency patients, the husband or someone may accompany the woman in an ambulance. Before Shabbos, one should try to prepare as much as possible to minimize the need for malacha on Shabbos itself. But it isn't necessary for a woman to stay nearer to the hospital during Shabbos to avoid travel, if this will be an inconvenience. And lastly, a woman is considered an emergency case for 7 days following the birth. For the first 3 days, malacha is performed for her, even if she does not ask for it. After these 3 days, one may perform malacha for a further 4 days if she or doctor requests
it. Thank you.
So that's the story.
Thank you.
So, yeah.
Okay. So I tell you where we ended off yesterday, just a minute summary, is we were talking about a roof. We were talking about Egyptians. And we said that in Egypt, you have to pay a constructional tax on the completion of a property. And the definition is when a roof's put on. So all these Arabs are quite smart, and they're robbers as well. So mixed thievery with smartness, and then they don't put roofs on. So they don't have to pay the government the tax. The unfortunate thing of it is they're not that smart because, I mean, although John, the tour guide, said that it only rains once or twice a year, it's nonsense that. We all know in Israel it's a Mediterranean climate, even Egypt is, and it does rain in winter. So I hope they get flooded. On that blessing, let's just go forward. We were discussing about having a fence on your roof. And the halacha is that you don't want to have blood on your hands. So what's considered blood on your hands is if it's 10 tefachim or more, it's lethal. So we were saying, look, there's a roof, then you need a fence around it. That was in Deuteronomy chapter 22, verse 8. And then it was saying, like, if it drops down, you're liable unless you have a fence. Then my question to the Gemara, which wasn't answered because I don't think it was really relevant to Rava, but Rava was basically saying to Rav Nachman is that, look, at the end of the day, how can you infer that for 6 tefachim it's legal when the biblical limit is to build a roof at 10 tefachim? So, because that's obviously the lethal potential. My question was, if you have a roof around it, on the roof to the ground, but suddenly when you've got the ground, like in Hanof, and you've got this drop, and then below 10 tefachim below that, you've got a roof that you don't have to build a fence around the barrier. So why not? But that's not the issue at hand in the Gemara. It's just my hang-up. So the bottom line of it is a good question to Rav Nachman. Rav Nachman's answer is he's saying, listen, he still holds the lethal aspect of the pit. And remember, Rava holds according to Shmuel for impact, etc. Rav Nachman holds according to Rav for foul air only. And Shmuel is impact and foul air. So what's the bottom line is that Rav Nachman says, yes, if you're taking impact to account, 6 tefachim are sufficient. And it could also be the fact that the first argument was Rava turned around and said to Rav Nachman, look, when we see in Sanhedrin in the 45th daf, you create a scaffold twice the height of man, which is basically, it's not 6 tefachim. That's basically 3 amos plus man is 4.5 amos. It's 6 times the size. How do we know? Is that 6 tefachim, a ditch, equals an amud. It's called the water irrigation amud. This is how the whole conversation came up. So what Arthur answered it very well because he did chazorah. He said it's a kindness to the person because you don't want them groaning in agony below while you start pelting them with a big rock. You want it to be nice and quick. So it's a kindness. Then we said, why not create it even higher? Because that'll definitely work. And Arthur remembered it, but he didn't say it, but I know he's done the chazorah, is we said we don't want the body to be grotesque. There's a fine line between dignity, quick, painless death, and splat. Therefore, we keep it at that height. So the argument now is, how can Rav Nachman say that 6 tefachim is considered lethal when the biblical ordinance is 10 tefachim, based on the fact that that's the point that you have to create a fence around your roof? And Rav Nachman's answer, guys, was what? See if you remember.
Another one with the cow standing up, but that's further down. That makes it 10. So what's this? The
question is, Rav Nachman answers to Rabba, and he said, look, I'm not saying, he says, I still hold that 6 tefachim all is lethal, in my opinion, by the way, but not my Damon, but Rav Nachman's. But he's saying that the reason why you put it on for 10 tefachim is that's considered the halachic house. So if you have 4 amas in the circumference or square from point A to point B across, okay, and you have 6 tefachim high, that constitutes a height of a normal house. And therefore, upon the creation of a normal halachic house, the obligation is to create a safe house. And that's when you put on a roof. If it's a house for midgets, hobbits, or dwarves in Middle Earth, in that case, there's no halachic ordinance.
Okay.
Yeah.
Can I ask you a question? So let's say a cow is walking, right?
Yes.
Isn't the height of the body and the legs also, because when you fall, the body falls from the height once the legs go?
Very good. So you and Gavin have done the work, and that's exactly where it's going to be going, the conversation. So that's exactly it. You guys have done the work, and I really, really appreciate it. So basically he replied, the requirement to make a fence on the roof is different, since any structure that is less than 10 tefachim tall and 4 amot wide is not considered a house. And the cited verse in the Torah requires a fence only for the roof of a halachic definition of a house. So then an objection is raised. Even now that the house is 10 tefachim tall on the outside, subtract from it the thickness of the beam and the plaster from the roof, and you'll find on the inside it's not 10 tefachim tall. Why is it considered a house? So what are we saying here is that, firstly, any structure that doesn't meet the criteria of a house, in other words, anything less than 10 tefachim tall and 5 almost square, is excluded from the requirement. That's from the Meiri, and that's from the Gemara in Sukkah 3a. Okay, even according to the Rambam. So basically, what's asked here is what happens if it's not quite 10 tefachim. Why is it not 10 tefachim? Because in the inside of the house, it's outside 10 tefachim, but if you take the thickness of the beam and the plaster that form the roof, the inside isn't 10 tefachim at all. So why do you consider it a house? In other words, the interior of the structure doesn't have that height. It's not fit for use of a residence. And then the objection is deflected because Rav Nachman replied, the brisa refers to a case where one dug out the ground inside of the house to a depth that matches the thickness of the roof so that the interior has a height of 10 tefachim, even though the roof is not more than 10 tefachim high to the adjacent land. So what he was saying is that in those days, what would happen is you would create a foundation and you could go to a basement level. And then you would dig down where you could crawl down some stairs and you have ample room for the roof, etc. Kev. So it doesn't matter as long as it's 10 tefachim high. Because the reality is that 10 tefachim is at the starting point before you create the roof and the beams, etc. So he was saying in the case where it's inclusive, it means that they've dug a basement level for the structure. Okay? So explanation is rejected. Why? By Rava. Because even if the house is not 10 tefachim tall on the outside, you can find it to be 10 tefachim tall on the inside in a case where you dug out the ground inside more than the thickness of the roof. In that case, since the interior is fit for use as a residence, the structure is classified halachically as a house, despite its low elevation on the outside. And the homeowner is required to make a fence on the roof. So why does the brisa exempt him? Okay, so the Gemara concedes and is therefore used to basically revise its understanding of Rav Nachman. So basically, we found that Rav Nachman might have a point here. So we're going back to Rav Nachman. And exactly as you and Arthur said, has Arthur gone AWOL? Arthur, are you there, mate? And that awkward silence when somebody has not attended a shir. All right. Rather, this is Rav Nachman's reason for ruling that the ox treifa, on account of having fallen into a canal 6 tefachim deep. Rav Nachman holds that we must consider the following. Exactly as Gavin and Arthur mentioned, how much space is there from the ox's abdomen to the ground? 4 tefachim. How deep is the irrigation canal? 6 tefachim. Therefore, we have a total from the ox's abdomen to the bottom of the canal of 10 tefachim. Accordingly, it emerges that when the ox struck the bottom of the canal, it struck from the height of 10 tefachim. Thus, Rav Nachman ruling is consistent with the principle that the impact of the fall from a height of less than 10 tefachim is not sufficiently severe to cause death. Okay? The Gemara wonders, but then consider our Mishnah, which teaches just as a standard pit has sufficient depth to cause death, being 10 tefachim deep, so too for any obstacle that is sufficient depth to cause death, which is 10 tefachim, one is liable. Why does the Mishnah require a depth of 10 tefachim, even when a pit of 6 tefachim is sufficient to kill an ox that falls in it? In other words, what the Gemara is saying is this question, guys, can only pertain to the opinion of Shmuel, who holds that the digger is liable on account of the impact. So if you're holding according to Rav, we don't need a depth of 10 tefachim because basically, you actually need 10 tefachim because that's the amount that the air stagnates, that becomes foul in order to be killable. If it's less than 10 tefachim, it can create serious physical ailments, but not necessarily enough to kill. As far as impact is concerned, if you hold according to Shmuel, even less than 10 tefachim is necessary. Okay? So the fact of it is, we wonder is if you're holding according to impact, can it kill, as far as that's concerned? So the Gemara answers, they say our Mishnah describes the depth that is necessary in a case where the ox is lying on the ground and rolls into the pit. But indeed, if it falls from a standing position and dies, the digger is liable to pay even when his pit is only 10 tefachim deep. In other words, if it basically rolls in from a sitting position, that 6 tefachim is a dodgy amount to be culpable for death. But if it's standing up, we know that it's 10 tefachim in total. Does that make sense? Okay, because you're taking that extra height from the ground where the animal can split itself open. So we're starting a new Mishnah, guys. I'm going to share my screen. You can just hang on for me 1 second. Thank you very much for doing Chazorah. I appreciate it. I really, really do.
But just one question, Damon. What happens if it's 4 tefachim and the animal dies? I mean, then there's exemption. It can't be less than 6. 6 is the 10 up to 6. That's it. It can't be less than 6. So there's no liability.
The question in the Gemara is as follows: is that if the Mishnah is talking about 10 tefachim, how can Rav Nachman say 6? So Rav Nachman can say 6 because he's taking into the account that the animal is on a standing position, and that adds another 4 amos in total, because from its feet to its abdomen is an extra 4, so that equals 10. So if it lands standing up and it splits itself from the abdomen by 10th, and you're holding Bashmuel with the impact, it's lethal. At 6, the foul air is not lethal. At 10, it is. But you can't then count that extra 4 from above the ground. So according to Rav, it wouldn't be lethal. According to Shmuel, and you hold by impact, it is, because that's a height. But just like we don't say for an elevation where there's that drop that you're liable, because Rav holds that in the public domain, you're not the owner of that hazard. It's only the foul air that you dig up that you're liable for. It's not sufficient. But according to Shmuel, who counts impact, you are for the 10th. It says, but if the animal is sitting down and rolls into the pit, you're not liable. The simple reason is because there's not 10 tefachim high. But in that particular case, why did he hold the owner of the ox liable for not getting benefit from his animal? Because he said that the ox itself, if you took the abdomen of the animal, which stood at a 4 amos height, plus the 6 amos on impact, at the end of the day, he had to have waited either for the animal to stand up or 24 hours to pass, so that the animal wasn't considered a legal treifa, meaning it was terminal, because you can't shecht and eat an animal that's terminal. So he should have waited. That's all we say. Nothing more complicated than that. So we need 10 tefachim high. That's the bottom line. Okay. Now okay. I'm going to share my screen, guys. Give me a sec. Kevin, good question. That makes sense. Let me just share the screen. Okay, this is the new Mishnah. And Kevin, do you want to read it in honor of the good question?
Okay. If there is a pit of 2 partners, it should actually be 2 owners, and the first one passed by it and did not cover it, and the second one passed by it and did not cover it, the second one is liable to pay for damages that it does.
Excellent. Excellent.
So only the damage after he didn't cover it, not the first guy.
Yeah. So the second one is liable. So we want to know why the first one is not liable, because if they're partners. Now, what do we mean in partnership? That they might be business partners that they spend money equally on creating that cistern. Okay? So they're both owners. They're owners in the partnership of the pit. Does that make sense? They're business partners. But we wonder why the second one is only liable for the damage it's done and not the first one. Okay. So, yeah.
So it's his action that caused it. He's in action.
Okay. So that's a good point. Basically, the one way you can look at it is the person that you finally leave the article to does bear responsibility. but I'll just tell you exactly one of the things that you need to consider. If the first one is exempt, it doesn't mean that the last one to pass by before the damage occurs bears the entire responsibility, Kevin, because the first one was also negligent in leaving the bore uncovered. He's not absolved by his fellow subsequent negligence. So, in other words, both partners share in the liability of the case. This specific case in the Mishnah is talking about a case where they both used the pit to draw water. So what happened was the first one finished it, and he left it cognizantly while the second one was still using it. So that's why the first one was justified in moving on his fellow to cover it. He's not liable. Does that make sense? It's different if they were both using it at the same time and there was a double water pail, because then the first one is equally liable. So it was a case where it's almost like he handed over ownership to him. Does that make sense, Kev?
Responsibility.
Yeah. In other words, if they're both negligent, they both have to pay. This is a unique case. They were both using it on common land or on public property, but they paid for it. And when the one finished, he finished while that other one was coming to the well to use it. So he let him have his chance. If the first one came and left it open and the second one used it, the second one could say, look, it was open when I got here, and they both have to share liability. It's only if I was at the well with Arthur, okay, and I see Arthur there, and I'm busy making sure I've taken my water, and I hand over the pail of water to Arthur to take over. At that point, I'm leaving because he's needing to use the service. At that point, it's his responsibility. It's equivalent if we both, does that make sense? Because there's an actual handover. And there's going to be a discussion in the Gemara, what constitutes a handover? Does it mean that it suffices to hand over the bucket to draw the water? Or do you have to hand over the cover to the pit or the cistern in order to actually make it totally obvious? What's the degree of responsibility for owner A giving it to owner B? So we'll discuss that. Okay? In the meantime, the Gemara starts. They say, how can a pit of two partners be found to exist? Well, what does that mean, guys? Because you call it a pit of partners, the Mishnah implies that except in the case that I mentioned above, where the one actually handed it over to the other and finished drawing the water, both of them are actually liable for the damage it does. Okay? But how is this technically possible? Why? Because it's fine if you hold like Rabbi Akiva. Okay, so how does Rabbi Akiva hold, guys? Guys, how does Rabbi Akiva hold?
Yeah, I saw Rabbi Akiva. There was this one small section of the Tanya.
All right, listen.
Rabbi
Akiva holds
the owner. That you have to be the owner of that. What's it called? Of that pit.
Correct. So if you say, fine, there's two business partners and they both technically own it, there's no problem. Okay, that's what the Gemara is saying, because you're liable to pay for damage with the pit within your own domain. The only thing you have to do is renounce ownership of the area around the pit. So if you've got a pit of two business partners or two financial partners, the courtyard can originally have belonged to both of the guys, right? And then you dig the pit and they both own the swimming pool, the pit or the water cistern, but they both renounce ownership of their property surrounding the pit, but they didn't renounce ownership of the pit itself. Does that make sense? So the pit is still theirs. That's the premise. You've got to allow people around the lip of the pit, and you can make that public, but you can't renounce the pit itself. And if you don't renounce the area around it, then they're trespassing. So then you cool according to Rabbi Akiva. But if you hold that you exempt for damage done by a pit in his domain, you've got a problem. So who holds by that? Rabbi Yishmael according to Rabbah. Do you remember there was Rabbah? There were two different opinions. Guys? And Rav Yosef. Do you remember there was Rav Yosef and Rabbah?
Yeah.
So Rabbah basically said that Rav Yishmael holds that there's no liability for a pit in a private domain. Because he was saying that when you say the owner of the pit, he's talking about the person that created the hazard or left it as a hazard when it was covered. So that's what we mean by ownership, according to Rabbah, that there's a liability factor. It's not about who really owned property. That's not Rav Yosef's opinion. Art, you were going to ask something. All right. So basically, then you've got a problem. Why? Because if you hold that one is exempt for damage done by a pit in his own domain, like Rav Yishmael according to Rabbah, how can you ever find a case where you're liable for damage done by a pit? It's only when it's in the public domain that you're liable. So how can you find a case where a pit of two partners creates liability in the public domain? In other words, if they had a bore in their joint domain and then they renounce ownership of the domain and the pit, they're exempt of liability since they didn't own the pit and they didn't dig it illegally. Okay, so that's a public domain. When you don't own the ground in it as well, never mind the surrounding area. So what do you mean you've got two partners? Because nobody actually owns the land in the public domain. The inverted commas owner of the pit with respect to liability is the person that dug it illegally. But how can two people be equally liable on account of digging the pit? Any suggestions, guys?
Yeah, because they previously owned the land together, and they denounced they retained the ownership of the pit, and they denounced the land around it. And becomes
okay, but if you're saying that, if they're saying that, that's fine. Rabbi Akiva will agree with you. But Rabbi Yishmael, according to Rabbi, won't agree with you because he's saying, look, he says you're only liable for a pit in the public domain. That's all you're liable for because he gets that biblical verse. Remember that biblical verse, and he says that if an ox or a donkey shall fall in the pit, what are they doing in your domain, especially if you haven't renounced ownership of the pit? Maybe you renounced ownership of the area around, but there's not going to be that sort of public hazard. So he says you're not liable. So
if they both dig it together so if you're going to go then not according to Rabbi Akiva, if you're going to go according to Rabbi Yishmael,
yes,
if you're going to go according to him, then the only example that would work is if two diggers dig equally. They dig 5 tefachim, then they're both equally liable.
Okay, but then we've got a problem because we've learned biblically that the last one created a lethal pit, not the first one, and therefore the second one is liable. How do both partners become liable?
If they do that final 10th one together.
Okay, well learned. That was excellent. So we're going to get to that point. So the thing of it is we've got a slight problem in the meantime before we get to that point, is that the Gemara suggested, what if you appoint an agent? In other words, you've technically got one digger, but both of them have given permission. They pay Solomon to dig a pit in the public domain. So, pardon?
Shlomo, you mean, Dan?
Shlomo.
Shlomo. That's right.
Listen, I didn't mean Solomon as in Philemon, okay?
Shlomo Schwartz, Damon.
Shlomo Schwartz. Shlomo Levine, okay? So Shlomo Levine is dug it on behalf of those two. They paid him. So it's one person's work, but they both paid him together. They split the fee and they paid him to dig the hole. Now, in that case, are they held liable?
No.
Why?
Because of the fact that an agent is responsible for his own actions. You can't assign something that's a transgression, that's that's against the Torah to somebody else, to a third person.
Excellent. Why not? Excellent. Why not?
Well, it's against the Torah, so you can't. That's why. And then second of all, that guy knows that it's, in theory, he knows that whatever he's going to do is against the Torah, so he shouldn't be doing it.
Excellent. So Gavin's got the right answer. Can I put it in maybe a simpler way? But Gavin's got the correct answer.
I'm not as articulate as you.
Some things derisive,
Okay, so the Gemara proposes if they both appointed an agent and told him, go dig a pit for us in the public domain, and he went and dug a pit for them, they're not liable at all because there can be no agency to commit an act of transgression. So let me explain what that is. Exactly as Gavin said, there can be no agency or agent to commit an act of transgression. So what we're saying is, if a person's commissioned, let's just say as a hitman, to be acting as an agent of the principal, okay, and he carries out the transgression, the principal who appointed him is not responsible for the misdeed. He is, okay, for the exact reason that Gavin said. Now, just one caveat: in the next world, Hashem will hold the person that hired him to commit the Aveira liable, but so you don't get out of it. But in this world, you can't. It's groma, it's indirect. So say, for example, you've got John Gotti that hires a hitman, but all he did is in the conversation, he turned around and said, this particular guy is giving me a headache. Please solve the problem. Now, the FBI's done tape testimony, okay, on that wicked man. And they've recorded him saying, so when they interview this guy, he turns around and said, yes, when I asked him to take care of the problem, I mean, go speak to him, be nice, offer him a bribe. You've got nothing on me. I just told him to try and see if he could negotiate with him. I didn't know he'd get 6 bullets in the front of his head. The negotiation didn't go as planned. In the meantime, negotiation went perfectly as planned, but you've got no evidence. So, since that is the case, you've got a bit of a problem. So you can't hold the principle, in fact, because there's lack of evidence. But it was explained perfectly in the Gemara in Kedushin in 52b, because we say to the agent, look, you've got two choices here. You can follow the word of the master of the universe, which is Hashem, and he commanded you not to sin. You had no right to kill the person. You had no right to, I'm just using something more dramatic than digging a pit, okay? Or you could listen to the person that hired you for the task and asked you to sin. Now, whose words should you follow? Exactly as Kevin said. Should you serve Hashem, or should you follow this contractor that paid you to commit the misdeed? So in that particular case, he has to follow Hashem. So he is responsible for not committing the sin, because everybody knows, Kevin, that what's right and wrong. You know it's wrong to commit murder. You know it's wrong to destroy property when you wouldn't want your property destroyed. So that person by the court, because there's evidence against him pulling the trigger or digging the pit, the court holds him liable. And if he turns around and blames the principal, again, this guy, John Gotti, would say, what do you mean? I told him to just take care of the problem, talk to him, see if he could be nice or whatever. Or you say in the case of the two partners about the pit, unless there's a tape record in that case, they'd say, what agent? We never commissioned him. And if they finally pressed and there's evidence, what would happen is they would turn around and they'd say, well, why did he listen to me? He has to listen to Hashem. I can't force him to do anything. The person that decided to do this knows it's wrong. It's his responsibility. He didn't have to listen to me. So in essence, in the 42nd daf of Kedushin, that's how it's argued. It says the principal can argue that he thought the agent would not listen to him, since to do so, the agent would have to disobey the master of the world. Therefore, the agent is viewed as having acted on his own, and the principal bears no legal responsibility for the transgression. but no legal responsibility, and Shemaimi would. So let's look at it in our case, guys. The digging in the public domain is a transgression. Why? Because you're going to ruin public property, and therefore the one who digs the pit can't be viewed as an agent of whose commission he was told to do so. So he's accountable for the own action because he knows it's wrong. And there's another transgression apart from ruining public property. It says in Vayikra chapter 19, verse 14, you're not to place a stumbling block before the blind person. What do you mean? Guy's walking along with his wife, suddenly disappears into a manhole. It goes according to also, you shall love your fellows yourself. Anything that you create in a hazard is not exactly loving your neighbor. So basically, we go back to Gavin's discussion. So what happens now if the first partner dug the first tefachim of the pit depth, and the second partner dug the last 5 tefachim? Okay? Then what happens there? Gavin asked a good question. He said, look, you've got a partner that dug 5 and the other one 5. And it is a good question. And as Kevin quite rightly said, is that the last one is liable. What's the reason?
Completed it. He is one that made it lethal, dangerous.
Correct. It was capable. You see, in the Chumash, it talks about it says, and an ox or donkey fell into it, and the carcass shall be his. Meaning in the Torah, it's talking about a lethal pit. It's not talking about an injurious pit. We're extrapolating from the Mishnahs and Braisot the nature of injury. But the original classical text in the Torah talks about a lethal pit. So therefore, it's only lethal when it's 10 tefachim or more. So the first one made it injurious. The second one actually created a lethal hazard. So therefore, the second one is liable. Now, there is a different opinion when you talk about Rebbe and the rabbis, and we'll go through the different opinions about injury and liability for death, etc. They don't hold the same. But what we do know is that as far as injury is concerned, there's two different opinions according to injury. The one is that they split the costs. So one made 2 tefachim and another one made maybe an extra 2 tefachim and 7, and it's just now a pit of injury. Okay, it's not a lethal pit. Now there's an opinion that you split the fee for the injury it causes the animal. That's one opinion. The other one is that there's a lot more accuracy involved. You split your percentile of damage. So if we take 2 tefachim and the other one creates 6 at 8 tefachim, is that then one covers, basically one is responsible for 3/4 of the damage and one for 1/4. So therefore they split where one pays 25% of the injury and the other one 75%. They don't split it half-half. Not every opinion says half-half. They say they share the injury costs, but it can get very specific. We'll cover that, just so you know. All right.
It's in the proportion according to the amount of damage I create.
Exactly. Then the action of the first one was set aside by the action of the second one, and the second one is fully liable because he created a lethal pit. The Gemara qualifies its question based on a Tanaic dispute below. Okay? All is well according to the opinion of Rebbe with respect to injury. You can find a case in which partners share liability for damage in a pit. But even according to Rebbe with respect to death, and according to the rabbis with respect to both injury and death, how can you find a case in which partners share liability for a pit? Okay? So what we are saying is that the rabbis maintain the last person is exclusively liable for any death or injury caused by the boar. And Rebbe maintains that the last one is exclusively liable for death, since he turned it into a lethal boar. But if the animal was merely injured in the boar, both diggers share liability. So who do you logically go by, guys? Yeah.
By the rabbi.
Well, I buy Rebbe, because Rebbe to me makes more sense. I'm not saying that the rabbis are wrong, I'm saying we all have a natural inclination to go with one opinion, and then sometimes we have to stretch ourselves to understand another opinion. So Rebbe is saying like this: for death, second person liable because he created a lethal hazard. He agrees with the rabbis. But the rabbis are saying the second person is liable in full for injury. Okay? And Rebbe is saying that both parties are liable for injury because both of them created an injurious pit. However, proportionate payment allowing, right? Meaning if one created 2 tefachim and the other one created 6 tefachim, there's a 25% versus a 75% payment for injury, proportional division. So to me, Rebbe makes more sense. I'm not saying the rabbis don't, but we all have an opinion that makes sense to us. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I completely with that.
All right. The Gemara answers, Rav Yochanan said, it's a case in which one of them dug a pit 9 tefachim deep, and then both of them simultaneously uprooted a clump of earth together. Well, obviously, that's the word simultaneous. From its bottom, and therefore completed to the pit of to a depth of 10 tefachim. So, in other words, first one dug, and together they pulled out the last one clump of earth, and therefore they were partners in the lethal nature of the hazard. Okay. Arthur, have you got a reshet issue because you're freezing a little? And I know it's summer there, so it would be a problem.
Probably. Reconnect.
Okay, just give me a sec. Just let's wait for Arthur. Did you like my joke, Kevin, my summer joke?
I want to take it a step further. I wonder if people in Greenland say that when they were using Zoom, if they say the screen.
No.
Makes sense.
Sure, funny. Listen, it's nice to have an easier section of the Gemara, to be honest.
Yeah, no, it does. It was quite an easy read.
We're just waiting for Arthur a sec.
Cold. What's the temperature? Is it very cold today?
No, funny enough, it started off cold last night, but it's warmed up today.
Yesterday, the whole day was freezing.
Oh, really?
Yeah. It was absolutely freezing from like the morning right through. And then last night, and today does look a bit warmer, but it's still, I'd say, colder side. Damon can't feel anything, so don't listen to Damon.
No, but today's pleasant. But last night, I could see from the hot water taps. Arth, so all he said, buddy, was that Rebbe makes more sense to me because he's saying, look, it's one thing to make the last one liable for a lethal pit because he created that lethal hazard. But if it's for injury, for 9 tefach or less, they share the injurious damages proportionately. That makes sense to me. The rabbis say that the last one is responsible for both death and injury. Yeah?
No, I agree with you.
So we're saying, all right, so how can they both be liable? Exactly as Glavin said, is that the first one dug, but they talk about liability now for death, is that 2 of them decided to take this baobab or whatever this root structure was out together, so they're partners in creating the lethal last tefach. Okay? As far as that's concerned, both the Rebbe and the sages say that they share liability for death, and certainly for injury, since there's no last person. They did it together. So Rebbe rules that they share liability for injury as well. The rabbis, well, they can't pick out one person in particular. Okay? Rashi says. So the Gemara now wants to investigate the dispute between Rebbe and the rabbis. What is the opinion of Rebbe and what is the opinion of the rabbis that we just mentioned? These are the following. It was taught in a brisa, if a person digs a pit of 9 tefachim deep and another comes and completes it to a depth of 10 tefachim, the last one is exclusively liable for any death or injury brought about by the pit. Okay? And so that's the opinion of the rabbis. Okay? Now, Rebbe says the injury party goes after the last digger to receive compensation for his animal's death. And he goes after both diggers to be compensated for any injuries. Okay, that's fairly straightforward. Okay, now the Gemara wants to know the rabbi's opinion. In other words, how did the rabbis derive it? They stated from a scriptural verse. Let me just see if I've got the verse written down here, or at least typed out. Okay, so Shmot chapter 21, verse 33. Kev? Shmot chapter 21, verse 33 in Exodus. That's where the rabbis get it. If a man shall uncover a pit, or if a man shall dig a pit, etc. Now, what if you liable even for the uncovering of an existing pit, and that's been dug by another person, okay, and then was covered by another person? Isn't it obvious that you must also be liable of digging a new pit because you created this hazard from start? It's not like you uncovered something that somebody created as a hazard. So if you even liable for not creating a pit but just reinstating the hazard, obviously when you are the master planner of a hazard, you're definitely liable. That was something that we covered in the last stuff. That was obvious, right? So then the Torah says, well, then there seems to be a superfluous wording, that you can use for a Gezerah Shava. Why does the Torah state if a man shall dig? Because it's obvious that you're liable. Rather, this comes to include one who digs the 10 tefach of a pit after another one digs the first 9 tefachim, and to teach that the last one has set aside the action of the first and therefore becomes exclusively liable for both injury and death. Okay? In other words, since he brought the pit to its current depth, the Torah holds him responsible for any damage caused by it. It's almost like you come past and instead of putting a manhole cover on, you further exacerbate the damage. Then the last one is liable because they could have circumvented it. Okay? So Tosfot doesn't agree. He asserts that this pertains only to a case in which the second digger transformed, as Kevin said, a non-lethal pit into a lethal one. In other words, he dug the 10 tefach. Because a lethal pit, guys, is a new entity. And that's why the digger is liable even for injuries. It's considered a new legal hazard. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Completely.
That's why the rabbis have gone with that approach.
Yeah, so that's why they say even for injuries, the last person's involved. But if, for example, the first party only dug 8 tefachim, and the second one just increased it to 9, who do you think would be liable for injuries? Is it one? Is it both? Is it the first? Is it last?
They're both responsible for injuries.
Why?
Because it's less than 10.
Yes.
At first,
That's
it's not dead.
That's exactly it.
Number 8 and number 9 covered 8 doesn't make a difference.
Correct. So it's not seen as a new legal status. I'll give an example. If you think it's being petty, is that say you get your driver's license and there's a code 8 and a code 10 in South Africa. The one is if it's over 3 tons, they sell like Isuzu Bakis in that, and I think like 1 tonners in 2.8. The minute it's over a certain weight, it then becomes what you consider a code 10, a commercial vehicle. It's not a lightweight commercial like a bakkie. So you might say, well, why define it? It's ridiculous. It's only maybe an extra 20 kilograms. But everything in legality has to have parameters. Even if you send an email address and it's .co.za and you put .co.za, it's not going to go to the right location. God's in the details. And unfortunately, whether it's fair or not fair, you have to define parameters at a certain point. There's always a boundary on a fence, Kevin, between properties. Do you know what I'm saying? There's always boundaries. Whether that's fair or not, you have to have parameters. Otherwise, there's no way. Everything will blur into each other. So exactly as Arthur said, doesn't make a difference if it's 8 tefachim to 9 tefachim. You haven't created a new legal entity, and the rabbis would assume that both people are liable as far as that's concerned. But if it's from 9 to 10, even if it's injuries, the last person pays. Rebbe says, as long as it doesn't cause death, then they share the expenditure proportionately. But if it does, the one who created a lethal pit is liable. Does that make sense? All right, guys. So we're almost done. So now that we've got the rabbi's opinion, we say that that's what that extra wording is coming to teach us. Now, there's a rejoin on behalf of Rebbe, because Rebbe, the question is if those wordings are superfluous. In other words, if you come to be taught by the Torah that if you open an existing hazard, you're liable. Obviously, if you create a hazard from scratch, you're liable. So both verses are not necessary. That's why the rabbis say you come to learn extra, that we talk about liability of the second person from those unnecessary extra words, because the concept of liability is a given, but not that the first would transfer liability to the second. So it's going to ask Rebbe what? Rebbe, well, how would you read it if it's unnecessary? Rebbe is going to tell you those verses, if a man shall uncover or if a man shall dig, are both necessary. So you can't expound to say there's a redundancy in the wording. Now, guys, do you remember what that was?
Yeah, that it's not a Bava Kamma, it's the other one.
Okay, well, explain to me if you can what the issue is.
No, if you have redundant words, then you can
Zera Shava.
Gezerah Shava, correct. But why does Rebbe say there's no unnecessary words here? Again, the rabbis are saying that the unnecessary word is, if I'm telling you that you're liable because you took a man cover off. What do you call it, Kevin? A manhole cover off?
Manhole cover.
Yeah,
manhole
and
cover.
Somebody else dug the pit, and now you're liable, but somebody else created the hazard. Obviously, if you're the master of the hazard and you create the damage from the get-go, you're obviously liable. I don't need a verse to tell me the obvious. Therefore, that extra wording has come to tell you that if the first one, Kev, are you awake, Kev? If the first one has liability and the second one now brings it from 9 amos to 10, he assumes full liability. That's what it's coming to teach us. So that's what the extra wording is used for, because it's obvious before. So the Gezerah Shava can only occur when you don't need that phrase, because the logical inference is obvious. You don't need it biblically written. Rebbe is saying it's not obvious. So we want to say to Rebbe, why? And this was discussed before. Wait 1 second, guys. I'm going to get the Gemara. I want to show you something. It was in 58. Just give me a sec. Sorry, guys, I'm just getting this for you.
Kevin, you must get a battery for your clock.
All right. All right, guys. Can tell me when you want me to read it to you?
Sorry, I disturbed Kevin. I thought his clock was like 9:30 there.
This actually doesn't work properly.
I can see that.
All right, so let's just go through this again. So Rab Yishmael holds that when one digs a pit in the public domain, he's also liable for the damage it does. For it's written, if a man shall uncover a pit or if a man shall dig, etc. Now, if you're liable even over the uncovering of an existing pit that has been dug, because he holds according to the rabbis by another and then covered, is it not obvious that he's also liable of digging a new pit? Why must the Torah state, or if a man shall dig? Rather, the Torah means to allude, as we stated before, you know what I'm saying, in terms of second-party liability. That's the issue. But Rabbi Akiva provides an interesting answer here. And Rabbi Akiva's answer is going to be the same as Rebbe. Okay, so Kevin, listen to this. Rabbi Akiva argues that those verses are both necessary and do not come to allude that we are dealing with an ownerless pit. For if the merciful one had written, only if a man shall uncover a pit and not cover it, he is liable, I might have said that for one who merely uncovers an existing pit, that covering it again is sufficient in order to be absolved from liability. But for one who digs a new pit, covering it is insufficient until and he remains liable until he fills it with the earth again. So the whole phrase that's mentioned in the Chumash is to tell you it suffices that he covers it with a manhole. He doesn't have to redig it. He just has to basically put the manhole back if he creates a new pit. Does that, in other words, if he opened up an existing habit, it was safe, he made it unsafe, he just has to put a manhole. So you might think if you create a pit from the get-go, that you're only off the hook in terms of liability if you fill it with sand. And Rabbi Akiva is saying, no, it's teaching you that if you just put a manhole over it, you don't have to go to the trouble of refilling it, because how many people are really going to go to refilling it? Very few. And he's saying, don't think that you're liable if you put a manhole, if it comes off from vibrations of horses and cars and whatever, because as long as you put a snug manhole, that's not your problem, because otherwise nobody's going to go to that effort, okay? And then you would think that maybe if the merciful one had written, only if a man shall dig a pit and not cover it, he's liable, I might have said that for digging a pit, then covering it is required in order to free the digger of liability, because he performed an original act creating an obstacle. But regarding an original, not an original one, but an existing pit that had been covered, where he did not perform an original act, I might say that even covering it is not required, because he didn't create the pit, he's entirely free of responsibility. So scripture states that a man shall dig and cover a pit, implying that even if you didn't create a hazard, if you reopened a hazard, you're responsible for sealing the hazard. So Rebbe is holding like Rabbi Akiva that both verses are necessary. There's nothing superfluous about it. Does that make sense? So the Gemara asks, but according to the rabbis too, is it not so that those verses are both necessary, as Rebbe argues? So the Gemara concedes and advances another source for the rabbi's opinion. Rather, this is the rabbi's reason. Scripture states, if a man shall dig a pit, and if I use the word, guys, if a man shall dig a pit, what does that imply? One or two men?
One.
Why? Because it's using the word man, a man. Okay, ish. It's not using the word men. So it's the singular. So it means that two people can't be liable for the damage. So therefore, only the last digger is liable, but the first one is exempt. Okay? So then the Gemara cites a rejoinder on behalf of Rebbe, and Rebbe is going to tell you, look, that phrase, a man is needed for the exposition, is to teach you that if a man digs a pit, he's liable for damage, but not if your ox or your dog starts to dig up earth and creates a pit. You're not liable for your animal that does the damage. So what are the rabbi's response to it? Is that, well, then why do you mention it twice? Two places it says a man in a pit. In other words, if a man shall uncover a pit, or if a man digs a pit. So if you want to just say that you're not liable for your animal, and it's only if you create it, mention it once. Why do you need it twice? So Rebbe turns around and says, look, it's written in two places because to exclude an ox that digs, and the other phrase is to say that, look, whether you're it's about stylistic consistency, and there's no particular exposition. There's no particular exposition at all. I mean, I could even say that you might think you're not liable if your ox digs up a manhole, but it's different to digging a hazard. But anyway, the bottom line is Rebbe says sometimes things are used for stylistic consistency. Does that make sense? So again, Rebbe holds that you're liable, both parties are liable for injury, even if it's more than 10 tafachim, because if it hasn't killed, hasn't killed. If it can kill, the last one's liable because it's lethal. But if it injures, they're both liable proportionately. The rabbi's saying it's a new legal entity of a pit. The minute it goes from 9 to 10, the last one's liable. But if it's from 8 to 9, they both share liability. Okay. Bottom line, that's game, set, match done.
Right.
All right, cool, guys. Have a good day.
You too. Cheers.
Right.